10 minutes. All right. So at the end of the last class, I mentioned that we got to sort of move on to a really exciting topic, talking about can non-human animals develop language? And I might have, you might have the impression by now that this is something that I study outside of teaching, so I have a little bit of expertise in this area. So I actually get to sort of diverge a little bit from what's talked about in the textbook. So hopefully you find that interesting. I'll probably go into a lot more detail than what you need to know, but mostly because I find it interesting and some students do as well. So hopefully you don't mind too much. But we've kind of covered a little bit of this topic when I was mentioning my research with our black-capped chickadees. So I mentioned that black-capped chickadees produce a call, and they have 4 distinct note types, A, B, C, and D, and they always occur in a fixed order. A's first, then B's, then C's, then D's. And they can produce more or none of any of those note types, but they always fall in that particular order. And in fact, I am currently in the process of trying to publish a paper that looks at whether chickadees care about the order of those notes. So I manufactured artificial calls that were either correctly ordered or scrambled, and then I looked at how they learned the properties or the qualities of ordered versus unordered in an operant conditioning setup. So same basic process as I described during my mini operant lecture, but looking at can they learn that correctly ordered things are rewarded and incorrectly ordered things are unrewarded, or vice versa. And I did actually find that they can form these distinct categories, with some exceptions. But that sort of highlights some of the, I guess, controversy in this field, because as I've been trying to get this published, my co-authors, who are much more into linguistics, they've pointed out some limitations. So things like I referred to the calls as syntactically ordered, meaning following the natural order, and then scramble ordered calls. But syntax is sort of more precisely defined and mostly only used for human language. So we can't use that. We also can't talk about things like grammar, or even things like information. If we're talking about communication, you have to be very careful about what you say and how you say it. So a lot of literature in this area, you'll find that the first chapter or 2 spends a lot of time talking about things like, here we define communication as, and then they'll go off and they'll list their exact definition for how they're using it. And that is because they will have reviewers and others in the field who come after them for wording. So you can figure out how I know that. But so there's a lot of sort of being very cautious in approaching this field. So if you ever start reading it, it's actually a very dense field to get into. And when the textbook starts talking about some of these things, they have some crossover with things that we've already talked about. So I mentioned the fact that we study chickadees and other songbirds specifically because they're vocal learners. So they need to listen to the vocalizations of adults of the same species in order to produce their species typical calls. So if they don't hear other chickadees, then they don't sound like chickadees. And that's what humans are. Humans are vocal learners, where we can't produce language unless we're exposed to other adults who speak language. So that kind of goes on with what we had talked about previously in talking about how we acquire language. But I also mentioned that there were other species who are vocal learners, things like dolphins and sea lions and whales and parrots and other primates. And there's a lot of overlap between that and the first line of the slide here, where we start talking about the species that humans have tried to teach language to. So a lot of the ones that they focused on are vocal learners because of that innate ability to acquire language. But I like to focus in here because the textbook doesn't quite make this apparent. But when we're talking about can animals develop language, they're specifically looking at can they develop human language. In a lot of these situations, they're saying, okay, we have dolphins and we have given them a keyboard, a waterproof board of buttons, and each button they push produces a word, and each word means something. What do they say? But we're teaching them English in most situations, sometimes other languages as well. We'll see American Sign Language is a big one for primates. But for the most part, we're saying how well can they acquire human languages? Very, very little of the research actually looks at the different modes of communication within those species, which is why I've had some issues breaking into the field, because I look at chickadee vocalizations and what they mean to chickadees, as opposed to how they interact with human language, which is the convention. So just something to keep in mind when you're looking at some of the things that they're reporting when we say that, oh yes, all of these primates can acquire some primitive human language. It's not necessarily telling us anything at all about their own communication abilities, because that's a lot more murky. But people like to look at what they want to look at, so we're mostly focusing in on, can they acquire human language? And most of the time, we're going to be sticking to, can they understand spoken human language, or can they use something else to produce something that has the same meaning? And the reason for that is there's a lot of issues with the vocal apparatus. So parrots are capable of mimicking and producing fairly human-sounding things, but most of the others don't have the ability to produce those sounds. So chimpanzees in particular, though they're very closely related to us and have many similar structures, their throats aren't as specialized and they're not capable of producing as fine sounds as we are in order to communicate. So that's why most of the research is focused on American Sign Language, because their hands are dexterous enough to do that, even though their vocal cords are not dexterous enough to do this. And as I mentioned, with dolphins, most of that work is done with buttons on a keyboard. A lot of the stuff that I talk about here that is beyond what the textbook mentions is because of that conference that I go to every year. It's a conference on comparative cognition, meaning that we look at how non-human species communicate and think and process at higher levels. So there's a whole section on language and communication. So it's kind of neat that I get to go in and talk with some of these people. So there's a lot of dolphin researchers. And so we get the story of, yes, they can use these boards to indicate things. So maybe they're going to, they want to play with a particular other dolphin. So they'll push the button for play, and then they'll push the button that corresponds to that particular individual. They can also, if you do something and ask them what you did, they can describe what you just did. So if you throw a ball to them and ask them what you did, they might hit the button for throw and ball. We also get the stories that when they first introduce these, the dolphins spend a lot of time pressing give, fish, give, fish. And you see very quickly their preference for different kinds of fish. Because if you sort of break it up and they can ask for haddock and cod and all of these things, they have their individual preferences. And they will ask for their favorite kind of fish over and over again until they learn that they don't always get fish. But it's kind of nice to get those stories in addition to the publications. This year, we had a virtual conference, and our keynote speaker was actually the woman who worked with Alex the parrot. So if you've ever looked into sort of parrot language, and as close as we've come to showing sort of higher level cognition in other species, the research with Alex was probably it. And so she worked with Alex for decades, I think, by the time he passed away. He died in his 40s, which is fairly young for an African gray, but old as compared to a lot of bird species. But she was talking about some of the work they were doing with Alex at the time, where he was starting to show sort of these novel combinations and concepts that were a lot more abstract than anything they'd ever seen before. So specifically, they'd have, say, a tray full of different objects. They'd be different colors, different shapes. And so she could ask him, Alex, how many red keys? And he could count all of them out, and he would give a number. And so he would ignore things that were not red, and he would ignore things that were not keys, and he could get just the red and key things. And she could ask him, okay, well, how many red and blue keys? And he could add those together and give her the numbers. And so he could describe things in those different ways. So she could have some more complex cognitive processes going on. But like I said, he ended up passing away quite suddenly, and they didn't get to sort of continue on with that line of research, where they were trying to see if he could handle some more abstract concepts, but still very, very interesting. So those are some interesting little case studies, interesting sort of one-off labs that have done some of this work. The vast, vast majority of research into non-human animal language development is done in primates, specifically chimpanzees, but there's also some with gorillas and bonobos and so on. So most of it is done with them, typically using American Sign Language or some kind of lexigram, so basically an image, a symbol. They'll have a card with a bunch of different symbols on it, and then the chimpanzee can point to the different symbols, and each symbol has a particular meaning. There's a whole bunch of different sort of variations of that. And so we can talk about two special cases, one being Washoe, who was a chimpanzee who ended up developing a vocabulary of more than 160 different words. But from our previous descriptions of some of the language abilities in other species, we might start figuring out that, okay, so using words and combining things and getting information across, it seems to be possible, but not at the same level. So specifically, Washoe was pretty much relying on things like that telegraphic speech we were talking about, kind of like what the dolphins were doing with their buttons, saying give fish. So you'd have a verb and you'd have a noun and not much else. So despite the fact that Washoe could combine different words and get across their point, could have a whole phrase, there was very little structure to the arrangement of those words. So even after years and years of working together, there wasn't a whole lot of grammar or syntax put together in those situations. And we're going to see that as sort of a reoccurring theme, because even with Kanzi, who was our next big name in this, Kanzi was a bonobo and worked with symbols, so lexicograms instead of sign language, but I think could also sign. The special case here was that Kanzi actually taught another primate in the enclosure to use the same signs. So we saw this transmission of that information, this sharing of knowledge between individuals. And so this other bonobo learned to use these sort of methods of communication without human involvement, which was really cool. And they would actually use those symbols to communicate with each other and then with the human handlers, even though the humans never taught the second bonobo how to use it. So that was very, very interesting. And so here we actually saw a big difference because they did long-term studies of this. So not just what's your vocabulary, but also what do you understand? So they looked specifically at receptive language, which we talked about as the things that you can understand. So if they asked Kanzi to do something, if they made a request, about 72% of the time, they would comply. They would do the right thing, even if they were novel combinations. So they understood the context. They just weren't necessarily producing sort of a full response, but they understood what was being told to them. And the really cool part there is when they did brain scans while they were doing signing or understanding different symbols, they'd see activation in something equivalent to Broca's area. So this is going to transition us very nicely into our next slide about evolutionary context, because this starts to give us this idea that, well, there's a lot of similar structures. There's a lot of sort of existing things that can be used for this language, but maybe the lack of the vocal structures, maybe the lack of complexity there led to an absence of an evolutionary push to develop language. So maybe their own language ability was impeded by there being no real selective pressure for it to occur. Whereas with humans, as we'll talk about, we sort of changed up our living situations. We started living in groups, and that led it to be far more beneficial for us to develop language, which would push us to get better at that, so that selective pressure. So maybe that pressure was absent in other primates, because a lot of other structures are fairly similar. And I've said most of this now, but just as a little bit of a refresher, because we've talked about evolution and natural selection before in this course, but evolution is just that long-term change of traits within a population over time. So if we looked at language as a species-specific trait, so it's a trait that humans have, and it would be the product of natural selection. So with natural selection, things that are beneficial, things that make it more likely for you to survive, and as you survive for longer, you're more likely to reproduce, and therefore your genes are more likely to be represented in the population in the future. So we get this propagation where those who have these beneficial traits reproduce more, which means that more people in the population have those beneficial traits, and they reproduce more, and over time, eventually the whole population has this trait. So the idea is that we developed this ability to acquire language because it was beneficial. And of course, with anything to do with evolution, we can't really sort of point to a particular piece of evidence and say, aha, this proves that this is what happened. But we can tell a logical story that says that it makes sense. So if we think about it, this ability to acquire language, this ability to communicate, would allow us to use secondhand information. So somebody could tell us, hey, don't go over there, there's a bear. The alternative, if somebody can't tell you that, is you figure it out through trial and error, which is you go over there and encounter a bear, which would be disadvantageous for natural selection. So that would be either immediately killing you, it might be injuring you, it might be using up too many resources, all things that are not conducive to survival. So being able to share that knowledge and not have to experience it directly would be beneficial. And we see more benefits as our groups get larger and larger. So as you have larger groups, you're actually able to benefit from everyone's knowledge. You can all share on your experience. So the more people in the group, the more collective knowledge. And so we actually see kind of this feedback loop where having sort of more complex brains, there's kind of this co-evolution. There's theories that we have a fairly large prefrontal cortex, specifically because it helps us remember and identify individuals that we've interacted with. So living in groups led us to have more complex brains, but also having more complex brains allowed us to live in groups. So it's kind of a which came first situation. But with this acquisition of language, we start seeing that, okay, so we can communicate with others. We can organize and distribute roles. So acquiring language allows us to live in larger groups, but living in larger groups actually increases the selective pressure to have us acquire language more rapidly. So again, this feedback loop. And we want to make that distinction here, where when we're talking about the trait, the language itself isn't necessarily the trait of interest. What we're more talking about is this ability to acquire language. So a little bit more specific in our wording. But we're saying that we have that biological predisposition, this ability to acquire it, and specifically to acquire it rapidly, which is beneficial. And then we have the social learning, where we learn the language itself from those around us. So again, an interaction of biology and environment, to go along with what we talked about last time. All right, and then our last of our random neat things before we talk about problem solving is this interrelatedness between culture and language and thought. And we've kind of mentioned this idea of linguistic relativity without quite naming it already. And this idea is that one's language determines the nature of one's thought. Basically, where I said that the words that you have available to you, the language that you know, can shape how you think about things. And so this was really pushed by Worf. So you might have seen this as Worf's hypothesis. And it focused on, again, basically saying that if you have the words to describe something or don't have the words to describe something, it can affect what you can and cannot think about. So if you don't have the words to talk about something, then you can't think about it. And he had specifically looked at perception of snow in languages that have different number of words for snow. So he focused in on English versus Inuit in terms of views of snow. And so in the English language, he said we only have 2 broad categories of snow. And then for the Inuit, they have many, many words related to snow. And of course, this was done in the 50s, so what he published as research was a lot of thinking and observing, but not really conducting any kind of real evaluation of what was going on. And if you ever wanted to read sort of a follow-up or a rebuttal to Worf's hypothesis, there are quite a few of them. Some of the issues go from as simple as, well, they completely neglected to mention things like hail and sleet, which could also refer to kinds of snow, to the other side of things where he overestimated the number of words that were used by the Inuit. So not the best of studies. We see another similar study, which was actually a study looking at color perception. So again, between English and here the Dani of Indonesia, so they have just 2 words for color. They group them into warm colors versus cool colors. Whereas in English, we can talk about yellow and orange and red and so on. And so this time, they actually set it up to look at, can individuals who primarily speak either of those languages differentiate between different colors? Can they categorize as sort of the same or different shades? And they found that there was a slight benefit to those who spoke English. So because they had more categories of words to fit into, they could tell the difference between these colors a little bit easier. Now, I always take a step back here because it's probably a lot more complicated than what we think it is. So when I was coming out of high school, I was that weird kid who couldn't decide if I wanted to do science or art. So I applied to physics and I applied to illustration at my local arts college. So that was my choice, was am I going to major in physics or am I going to illustrate? I ended up doing neither, but that's all right. So I did a lot of drawing and coloring and painting, and I worked with color a lot. And so I found growing up that I could have, say, a whole bunch of colors, and I could tell apart very similar shades. So I might show my friends a bunch of swatches. I want to paint my room. And I'd say, well, which of these 4 do you like? And they'd go, they're all gray. It doesn't matter. Like, what's the difference? It's like, well, this one is sort of a warmer undertone, and this one's kind of a greeny undertone, and I can tell the difference, but they can't. So I think that there's a big role here of experience. So if you are used to differentiating between those colors, then maybe your ability to differentiate improves. And so if we think of it in relation to this study, so when we learn English, you sit in kindergarten and they show you a yellow crayon and they say, what color is it? You say yellow. And this orange one and this red one. So you're categorizing, you're experiencing that sort of dividing up. Whereas in a language that only cares about warm versus cool, they wouldn't have that same kind of practice. The distinction between the colors doesn't matter, therefore they wouldn't be using it. So yes, there is theoretically a difference, but maybe not because of the language itself, but because of the experience that comes along with it. And a lot of studies take that into account, but I find that many textbooks don't go into that much detail. But just an interesting way to look at it. And of course, there are people who still strongly support this linguistic relativity, saying that it drives everything and that people will think more positively in positive languages and more negatively in negative languages and so on and so forth. But most of the research will agree that if there are effects, they are typically fairly small. All right. And then that brings us to problem solving. So how do we approach and frame problems? And of course, we always start off with our definitions. So we're going to call problem solving our active efforts to discover what we have to do to achieve a goal that's not readily attainable. So if we encounter a situation and we can already see what we have to do, if there's nothing to overcome, if the goal is easy to get to, then it's not technically a problem. So we add that sort of caveat that it's something that isn't readily attainable. It's something that we have to work towards, hence a problem. And so we're going to be solving that problem. We're going to be using some logic and reasoning and some kind of processing to get from our starting point to our end point. And so we're going to talk about 3 distinct types of problems. So the first of these are problems of inducing structure. And so these require people to discover the relationship among numbers, words, symbols, or ideas. Basically, can you make connections? Do you understand the relationship, and can you expand on that? And the textbook gives us a lot of nice little examples of each of these types of problems. So here we can look at analogies. So you might have seen these before in other classes. So here they have pairs of words, and one of them is missing, and you have to kind of fill in the blank. So we have merchant and sell, and then customer and blank. And so you might have seen these worded as merchant is to sell, as customer is to blank, or sell is to merchant, as blank is to customer. And what they're basically saying is, given the relationship between merchants and selling, what is the equivalent to that relationship with customers? And so merchants sell and customers buy. So that would be how you fill that in. And then our next one is lawyer is to client as doctor is to blank. So we would say patient. You have probably noticed, or maybe you haven't, I don't use these kinds of questions. I go out of my way to not select them when I'm doing things like putting together quizzes or practice tests or exams. Textbooks absolutely love these concepts. They love including them, but I find that they involve a lot of abstract thought. And especially, it requires you to be pretty good at being a thesaurus, where you have to kind of understand all of these different words and their meanings at a very particular level. So I find that these tend to cause problems, which is why I skip them. But if you've ever worked through practice problems from a textbook, or you've seen them in other classes, they're usually included in textbook pools. I don't like them, so I skip them. All right, so that was our problems of inducing structure, where we care about our relationships, so we solve by understanding relationships. Next, we have problems of arrangement. So they require us to arrange the parts of a problem in a way that satisfies some criterion. So we're going to be given some end goal that we have to accomplish, and there are certain things that we can and can't do, and we have to get there in the end. So usually the different parts can be arranged in a bunch of different ways, but not all of them will lead you to the correct solution. So here we're going to look at 2 examples. We're going to look at a string problem and some anagrams from the textbook. But before that we get to that, I want to talk briefly about insight, because most of these problems of arrangement are actually solved through insight. And again, this is another topic that we talked about earlier on in the course. So you might remember insight from when we were talking about learning, specifically Thorndike and his cats in the puzzle boxes. And we had mentioned that Thorndike was looking at the difference between insightful learning and our incremental learning. So in that case, Thorndike had found that his cats were in these boxes, and they would be in the box for a really long time. And as time went on, they'd figure out the solution to get out of the box, and they'd do that behavior more and more often. So they'd go from spending a lot of time in the box and then gradually get out faster and faster until they escape from the box fairly quickly. So we would see that incremental improvement because they were learning to do the behaviors that got them out faster more and more often. But the alternative that he had predicted was that insight, that aha moment, where if it was insightful learning, the cats would be stuck in the box until they had that aha moment. And once they got the aha moment, then all of a sudden they would be able to escape very quickly every single time. So we would go from no escape to all the time escape sort of in one trial. And that would be sort of separated by this insightful moment, that aha moment where they finally figured it out. And so with these problems of arrangement, usually it involves us sitting there, trial and error. Okay, well, what if I did this? No. What if I did this? And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, if I do this, that's your insight moment. And then you'd know the solution from there on. And so we can use our two examples from the text for this. The first is the string problem. And I'm just going to read this one. And it says, 2 strings hang from the ceiling, but are too far apart for a person to hold one and walk to the other. On the table are a book of matches, a screwdriver, and a few pieces of cotton. How could the strings be tied together? And so this one, it's getting us the setup, what we have to do, how do we get there? And the solution that the textbook gives us is to attach the screwdriver to one of the strings and swing it like a pendulum, then go and hold on to the other string, catch the swinging screwdriver and tie them together. That's great and all. When I looked at this, my initial gut instinct was, well, why don't we move the table? And then we just stand on the table and you're up at the ceiling and tie them together. We'll actually mention that in a couple of slides as a situation of functional fixedness where most people don't think to rearrange the furniture because it's not automatically included in your brain as something that you can use to solve the problem. But yeah, so that's the apparent correct solution. It's a little bit easier to visualize things like anagrams, where the order that we're focusing on is arranging the letters in these words. And this is usually something where you look at it and you're like, well, I have no idea, until you see it, and once you've seen it once, you know exactly what it is you're looking at. So for myself, I got the first one. The first one is water. The second one, I had to look up. I asked the textbook what the answer was. And it is Joker. So I don't know if it's the fact that there's a J and a K there, but it threw me off completely. But once I had seen it, I can now not unsee it. I know exactly what it is every time going forward. So for these ones, we're focusing in on arranging things in a particular order and we're satisfying this criterion. So we're doing a particular set of things and we're solving that criterion. And then our last type are sort of the most complex of these, and these are problems of transformation. So here, we're required to carry out a sequence of transformations to achieve a specific goal. So here, we're still doing sort of a sequence of things, but the focus here is that we're changing the situation with each step. So we're performing a transformation, we're changing something as we go. So again, a couple of examples. We have the hobbits and orcs problem and then the water jar problem. And these are actually fairly common, but very weirdly worded for the textbook. And these can be challenging, these transformations, because you know where your starting point is, and you know what the goal is, and you know your rules to get from the start to the goal, but it isn't always apparent how exactly to get from one to the other. So for the hobbits and orcs problem, you've actually probably seen this, maybe not called the same thing. I've seen it as the wolf and sheep problem, or the pigs and lettuce problem. But the basic idea is that you have a river and you have a boat, and you have two things that cannot be left alone together based on different criteria. So here for our hobbits and orcs, they say that you can't have more orcs than hobbits on one side of the river. So if you have 2 orcs and only 1 hobbit, the 2 orcs will gang up and eat the 1 hobbit. But you can have 2 and 2 and that's fine. You can have 1 and 1 and that's fine. You can have more hobbits than orcs and that's fine. But you have these restrictions. And so you have to logic your way through, how do you get them all from one side of the river to the other without ever leaving sort of unequal numbers on either side? And so the solution to this one is a time-consuming process. So they include the restriction of you can only fit 2 in the boat at a time. So we have that. And so to go from the beginning to the end, you'd have to do all of these steps. So you're changing the conditions with each step because you're moving things from one side to the other. Our water jar problem, which again, you've probably seen, maybe not called the same thing, usually involves having 3 different pitchers. So 1 large, 1 medium, and 1 small. And so here they're saying, okay, so you have large, medium, and small. Here are the exact numbers. Using only these things, and you can sort of fill them and empty them as much as you need to, we need you to get exactly this particular volume. So here they're saying using these 3, we need you to get exactly 100 cups. And so the solution to this, if you work through it, is you take one of the big ones, subtract one of the medium ones, and then subtract 2 of the smallest ones. And we're actually going to come back to this example in just a moment when we talk about our barriers to effective problem solving. But so again, we're starting at the beginning and then we're sort of moving around what water we have where in order to get to our end point of only having 100 cups. All right, so for our barriers, some of the things that we can encounter that cause problems with solving these issues, things like irrelevant information. So maybe on exams, you've encountered a situation where the instructor gives you lots and lots of details, but when you get to the end of it, you say, wait a second, I didn't need any of that. I only needed this piece of information to solve the problem. So you might become hung up on the earlier stuff. It might set you up to assume that the question will ask you about this, and it can actually set your mind to think about the question in a particular way. So some instructors use that as a sort of way of tricking people who aren't quite well prepared for a situation. I find that that leads to very wordy questions, and especially where I like to have fairly quick responses, I typically remove most of the extra information. But you will occasionally see that. And then, of course, in the real world, when you're not just looking at solving an exam problem or solving a logic puzzle, this extra information might just be things in the environment, things that just aren't relevant to the situation. So you might be in an entire situation, but all that matters is what's right in front of you. So you need to ignore everything else. We also worry about functional fixedness, which, again, I already mentioned. So the idea that sometimes people get hung up on what the role is for particular items. So maybe it wouldn't have occurred to you to rearrange the furniture to solve the problem. Another study that I've seen is they have participants again in a room. They hand them a box with a candle, some matches, some pins, and some loose cardboard. And there's a bulletin board next to the table, and they say, using the supplies, we need you to set something up so that the candle, while lit, doesn't drip wax on the table. And so most people will start pinning the candle to the board and using the cardboard underneath it to try and hold on to the wax. But some people would then just light the candle and put it in the box. So some will frame it as the box is a container that holds all the supplies, and then other people will be like, well, it's also a usable thing. And it is remarkable the number of people that it doesn't occur to them to do that. So there's tons of studies on that. And that kind of falls into the last category, the unnecessary constraints, where people make a lot of assumptions about what you can and cannot do. So moving the furniture might be a social no-no, but it might also solve your problem. So there's some overlap there. Another idea of unnecessary constraints is seen in the 9-dot problem, which, again, if you've ever seen this, you have knowledge of what the solution is. But they say, without lifting your pencil, that you have to draw only 4 straight lines and connect all 9 dots. And in order to solve this, you actually have to go outside of the boundaries of the box. So there's a square around those 9 dots, and people assume that they have to stay within the square. But in order to solve this problem, you have to go off the page. And the textbook lists all the possible answers if you're curious. But yes, so you have to, again, think outside the box to solve this problem. So you would have to go further outside in order to then connect all the dots. And then the last of these is mental sets, which I'm going to bring us back to that idea of our glasses of water. And so mental sets are basically this idea that once you've solved a problem, you have an existing rule set, a sort of solution that you can pull out of your back pocket. This has worked in the past, so it might work in the future. So for our solution with that water jar problem, taking one of the big jars and then subtracting one of the medium and 2 of the small solve the problem. If we changed our values, if we mixed up the numbers, we made some bigger, some smaller, and said, okay, do it again, but this time we need you to have this much at the end, a lot of people would try the thing that just worked. So, okay, does it work if I take one of the large ones, one of the medium, take away one of the medium, and then take away 2 of the small? And if it does, they typically don't look any further. But what if, say, taking 2 of the medium solved the problem on their own? That's 2 steps instead of 4 that we had used for the previous solution. But a lot of people miss out on the simpler solution because we have a mental set. We think we know what the answer is, and if it works, we don't look beyond it. So we can run into these issues where a mental set can be beneficial. If you've encountered that problem before, then you have sort of a vague idea of how to approach it. But it can also lead to non-optimal solutions because it might not occur to you to approach it in a different way that hadn't worked in the past, but can work now. So all of these are different things that can get in our way when we're trying to solve some of our problems. All right, and so I'm going to leave it there for today. Our next couple of slides are all about algorithms and heuristics and different ways to approach problem solving. But like I had mentioned, my intent is for us to wrap up the course Wednesday, which we only have 10 slides left, so we should be well on track to finish on Wednesday. And then on Friday, I'm going to come in kind of the same as last Friday, where it was just sort of me in the room, but this time giving you guys the opportunity to ask questions if you want to go over any topics or anything like that. I'll have my laptop and all my old slides so we can chat, answer questions, go back over concepts, whatever you'd like. But no set structure. I'm not preparing anything. I will just be here with my slides and my knowledge.